If you all remember, the first step of the scientific method is ask a question. Remember, that question that you ask is based on an observation that you may have made about something in the world around you. Once you've made an observation, kind of thought, I wonder, and asked a question, you need to make sure that that question is asked in a format that can actually be answered by science. We all ask questions to get answers, but scientists have to ask questions in a specific way that can be tested through scientific investigation. So you want to answer your questions through scientific investigation. That leads to some questions being answered more easily than others, and there's certain things that happen in the world that even though science is learning more about the world around you, there's certain things that you can't find out through science. Scientists have to ask questions that can be answered through an investigation. If you do an investigation, you have to be asking a question in a way that you can measure it or experiment. You have to be able to collect data. If you can't collect data so that you have that big word evidence, then nobody's going to believe what you did in your investigation, and you really can't get a conclusive answer. Remember, in science, it has to be done so that somebody else could repeat it and get the same results. So when we ask a question, we have to ask one that we can measure to collect data so that we have evidence to convince people that what we collected is true. There are certain things in the world that we just can't ask questions about because some things relate to things that we cannot measure. So think about this. Could we go measure whether people have a sixth sense or not? Sometimes people claim we have a sixth sense, but that's not really something that we can measure. Also, there's still controversy about whether there's really UFOs. So science, we can't really ask a question about whether a UFO is real or not. Other questions depend on things that are personal preferences. You can't conduct a scientific study about something that's somebody's personal preference. You can't do a scientific study about what's your favorite song, or do you like chocolate, or why chocolate candy is better than fruit candy. Another type of question that is not a good question to answer in science is one that depends on people's moral values or facts and opinions. You can do tests over things that are facts, you shouldn't do tests over things that are opinions. So no tests over things that are opinions. And lots of times moral values are opinions. Even though many of us may hold the same thing to be true, moral values are an opinion. So we can't do scientific studies about churches, Roe versus Wade, which had to do with abortion, or the death penalty. Those are things that people might have different answers based on their moral values. The last thing that we shouldn't ever try and ask scientific questions about are things that relate to supernatural. So that's things like ghosts or aliens. So these are things that you should never ever be asking scientific questions about. These are no-nos for scientific questions. So these are things no scientific questions should be asked about. We should ask things about objects and organisms, things that we can test through experiments, but we can collect data about. So let's look at some questions. The first thing we're going to do is decide whether the question can be answered through a scientific investigation or not. If the question can be answered, we want to come up with related testable questions because maybe the question wasn't asked in quite the way that we could answer, but we can rephrase it. We want to be looking for cause and effect relationships. If we can't answer the question through investigation, we might be able to rewrite it and come up with a related question. So for example, on your note organizer, you should see that there's an example or a sample question. The question is, does what you eat affect the appearance of pimples. So you're going to run this through the test. Is it a question that relates to something that we can't measure? I think we could measure zits. Zits don't take personal preference. I can get them, you can get them, moms can get them, dads can get them, aunts, uncles, everybody can get them. Zits have nothing to do with moral values. They're not choosy, and they're definitely not supernatural. So I think that this is probably a question that would be okay. This is a question that, yes, we could answer through scientific investigation. But now we want to try and write it in a way that it's even more testable. We want to narrow it down. So an example of something that we might be able to test is, if I eat more chocolate than normal, will I get more zits? These are two things that you can measure. I can measure if I'm eating more chocolate than I normally do, because I could measure for a couple weeks how much chocolate I eat, and then I could increase the amount of chocolate that I eat and measure how many zits I had before and how many zits I have after. Another way I could rephrase this question, or I could come up with a related question, maybe I think I've heard like grease, like fries or potato chips can cause zits. So I could ask the question, if I eat McDonald's fries every day, will I get more zits, than if I don't? So again, this is something that I can measure. I could go a few weeks eating absolutely no fries. I could record how many zits I get. Then I could go back and start eating a small order of McDonald's fries every day. And I can measure how many zits I get during the 2 weeks I'm eating it and the 2 weeks afterwards. Both of these are experiments that would take time to do, but they are both testable experiments that are about real life things that I can measure, I can conduct, and I can collect data and evidence. When you come back to class, we're going to take a look at these questions, and we're going to try and decide whether these questions are testable or not, and we're going to try and come up with related questions. So in review, I want you to understand that testable questions in science have to do with objects, organisms, and events and real-life things that happen in the natural world. Testable questions are those that can be answered through investigations that involve experiments. They also can be answered through observations and surveys. Testable questions can be answered by collecting information. They should also be answered by analyzing evidence that is measurable. You have to have evidence. It has to be measurable. It has to be something that anybody could look at and decide and believe it's true and come to the same conclusion as you. Testable questions relate to scientific ideas. They do not relate to personal preference or moral values. Remember, these are no-nos as far as asking scientific questions. We don't ask about personal preference. We don't ask about value or about moral values. Finally, again, testable questions do not relate to supernatural things like aliens or ghosts or non-measurable phenomena. We want them to be about real things that we all know for a fact are in the world. So if you ever have a question about what can be tested and what can't, you could always ask yourself, is it a fact? Or is it an opinion? And opinions, remember, no, we can't test over opinions. When you come back to class, you need to be able to look at questions and ask yourself, is this a testable question? You can run through the checklist. Is it something we can measure? Is it a personal preference? Does it involve moral values? Is it supernatural? Really, you could just narrow that down. Is this something that's a fact that I can measure, or is this something that is somebody's opinion?